Beyond the western edge of the Star Wars galaxy, past the last charted hyperlanes of the Outer Rim, lies a vast and largely unmapped expanse that the rest of the known galaxy has simply called the Unknown Regions. A place whose outer boundaries appear on the old Imperial charts as a soft, fading edge of light, and whose interior has never been fully mapped by any of the powers that tried. Because the hyperspace anomalies, gravitational distortions, rogue magnetospheres, and stellar phenomena that fill it make ordinary navigation almost impossible. It is a region where standard Navy computers failed, where probe droids returned with broken signals, and where ships, fleets, and entire expeditions routinely vanished without ever sending word back, while the species who lived inside it continued, across most of recorded galactic history, simply not to be found. Chapter 1. Before the Republic. Long before the Republic was founded, long before the first Jedi sat together to consider the nature of the Force, and long before any of the species that would later call themselves the great powers of the galaxy had even risen from their homeworlds, the Western Fog already existed, sitting at the edge of the spiral arms in a silence so old that even the records of the Celestials, the godlike architects whose vanished works still shaped the visible galaxy, did not seem to remember a time when it had not been there. In older tellings preserved by scholars who studied the deep past, the Celestials themselves were the ones who built the hyperspace anomaly that bisected the galaxy and walled off the unknown regions from the rest of charted space. And the reasons given for that construction were never entirely consistent, with some accounts treating the barrier as a kind of gift, and others treating it as something closer to a defensive wall, raised in a hurry against something the Celestials feared enough to seal away from the worlds they cared about. There are scholars who have argued, in records since lost to most of the modern archive, that the wall the Celestials built was raised against a single thing, a presence that had already been moving through the deep western void for an age, before the Celestials understood what they were looking at, and that the barrier was less an act of design and more an act of containment, finished quickly and abandoned before the architects could explain what it was meant to hold. Whether any of that is true, no record now living can confirm, and the Celestials themselves disappeared so completely from galactic history around the same time their other works fell silent that the question of what they were doing in their final centuries has remained, across every era since, one of the quieter mysteries of the deep past. What survived them, in the older tellings, is a thing that does not remember being young. On a world called Mugfallow, near the western edge of the charted reach, a planet-spanning ooze the color of cold ash covered nearly the entire surface of the globe, and the scattered records of the few who studied it from a safe distance, mostly Chiss researchers operating from the Ascendancy's great data library on Csilla, which held the most extensive archive on the entity of any civilization in the galaxy, and who paid bounties to any crews willing to attack its infestations rather than approach the system directly, described an entity that called itself, in the moments it chose to communicate, by a name that the recorders rendered as Mungal Mungal. It claimed, in the manner of an entity speaking to species younger than itself, to have watched the Celestials disappear. It claimed to have been there before any of the architects of the galaxy first arrived. It claimed, in one of the most often repeated and least verifiable of its statements, to have witnessed the disappearance of the Celestials, and to have outlasted civilizations such as the Sith Empire, which had once been a power of note in the region and was no longer. The Chiss scholars who recorded those claims added a caveat in the archive margins, that Mungal Mungal was regarded in its own corner of the chaos as a speaker of elaborate lies, and that the claims had been left on record not because they were verified, but because no one had been willing to test them at the source. The ring of derelict ships that surrounded Mug Fallow, slowly turning in the system's quiet orbit, suggested that the entity was, at the very least, not lying about its age. Among those wrecks were vessels whose hull markings had not been used in galactic shipping for more than 30,000 years, including the dark and worn shape of what was once a Gree sail ship from an era so far back that the Gree themselves had largely retreated from contact with the rest of the galaxy, and at least one barge of a kind once said to have belonged to the Corsair King Shim the Despot, drawn there by crews aboard who had already been taken by the ooze in some earlier encounter, their bodies still moving the helm under what was no longer their own will. None of the ships ringing the planet still carried living crews, and none of them ever had by the time they arrived. What they carried instead, the records did not describe at length, and the few researchers who did describe it in detail tended not to return for second visits. What the Celestials had been afraid of, if they had been afraid of anything at all, the records do not finally say. What they left behind, in the form of the barrier that walled off the chaos from the rest of the galaxy, would survive them by a span of years that made every other empire in galactic history look brief. And when, some 30,000 years before the founding of the Old Republic, the Celestials themselves quietly disappeared from the records of the worlds they had once shaped, the western fog they had walled off was still there, still untraveled by all but the species native to it, still keeping its own slow time in a corner of the galaxy that had been, even in the earliest histories, very nearly the oldest thing about it. In older tellings, long before the Republic charted its first hyperlane and long before any of the great powers of the modern galaxy had even reached for the stars, the western world that would later be known as Lehon, sometimes called Rakata Prime in the records, sat alone in a quiet stretch of the deep chaos with no history that anyone alive still remembered. And into that quiet, before about 36,000 years ago, came the Qua, a species of tall and reptilian beings who had crossed the galactic distances by means of a technology no one else had ever possessed. A network of standing stone arches they called infinity gates, which they could open in one place and step through in another faster than hyperspace and silent in operation, and which they had used for an age to travel among the worlds they had chosen to teach. The Rakata of Lehon were the species the Qua chose to teach in that corner of the galaxy. They were strong, intelligent, ambitious in a way the Qua appeared not to recognize as a warning. And the Qua, for reasons the older tellings preserved only in fragments, set about sharing with them what they could. They taught the Rakata the use of starships and the principles of long-range travel. They taught them the practice of the Force itself, including the careful balance the Qua themselves had followed for an age. Though what they did not share across all those early centuries was the architecture of the Infinity Gates, and that refusal would prove to be the seed of the war that followed. And the Rakata, in the gift of the Force, and what it cost the galaxy for 30,000 years afterward, took everything their teachers had given them and discarded what they had been told about balance, drawing only on the dark side of what they had been shown, using that power to control machinery, to command other species, and to extend their reach across distances that no other civilization in the Western galaxy had ever crossed. For some centuries the gift held, and the Rakata appeared to flourish under the patient tutelage of their teachers, but eventually, in the way of species that have been given more than they have earned, the Rakata decided that the Qua were keeping something back. Namely the Infinity Gates themselves, which the Qua could use to move freely between worlds that the Rakata could not reach. And the Rakata, increasingly hungry for the reach that the gates would give them, turned against the species that had raised them. The war that followed was short by galactic standards and ruinous by every other measure, ending with the Qua destroying the Infinity Gate on Lehon itself, at a cost the older tellings describe as so great that the survivors of the Qua retreated entirely from the galactic stage and were never again seen in numbers. And with the Rakata, denied the gates, but in possession of nearly every other gift their teachers had ever given them, free to do with the galaxy whatever they chose. What they chose to do, around 30,000 years before the Empire, was to build the Star Forge. They built it over a star they had selected for its raw output, the star known in the old maps as Abo, and they raised the construction directly into its photosphere, feeding the assembly directly off the star itself through tethers that drew matter and energy from the burning surface in volumes no civilization since has been able to match. What came out of the Star Forge, in the centuries after it began its work, was a fleet that did not stop building, with new ships leaving the forge at a rate the rest of the galaxy could not have understood, and old ships melted down and rebuilt to feed the same assembly. And the darker currents of the Force were said to run through the very metal of the hulls themselves, drawn from the forge's own connection to those currents and from the fear and pain of the conquered species fed into it. At its peak, in the ancient histories most often cited by Republic scholars, the infinite empire of the Rakata held some 500 worlds across the Western galaxy, and its census, taken in the way the Rakata took such things, listed roughly 10 billion Rakatan warriors and roughly 1 trillion souls held in bondage to them, drawn from every species the Starforge had carried their fleets to reach. The Rakata themselves did not labor, did not farm, did not build, did not transport, and instead fought, ruled, fed off the dark connection that flowed through their priests, and watched those they had conquered carry out the work of the Empire on every one of the 500 worlds. It was, in that era, by some accounts the largest single political entity the galaxy had yet seen, and by all accounts among the cruelest. And the Rakata of that era believed, with the confidence of a species that had not yet been corrected by history, that the infinite empire would simply continue, would expand at the rate the Forge built ships, would outlast every other power in the galaxy. What corrected them, around 25,000 years before the Empire, came in 3 forms, none of which the Rakata had expected. The first was a plague that moved through their priesthood and stripped them, individually and then in larger numbers, of the connection to the darker currents of the Force that had been the entire foundation of their power, leaving Rakatan commanders standing on the bridges of their warships, unable to reach the force they had been raised to use. The second was the Great Revolts, rising across the 500 worlds at once as the conquered species recognized that the priests had grown weak, with conquered captains turning the Forge-built ships against the Rakata fleets that had brought them, and conquered laborers tearing down the infrastructure they had been bred to maintain. The third was the civil war that followed inside the Rakatan species itself, with warlords blaming warlords, families turning on families, and Lahan, the homeworld, becoming the central battlefield. By the time the dust settled over Lahan, the surface of the homeworld had been torn into an archipelago, with what had once been continuous continents broken into islands separated by new and rising seas, and the great cities of the Rakata reduced to the kind of ruins that would not be found again for 15,000 years. The atmospheric disruptor field that the Rakata priests had projected from the Temple of the Ancients, designed in the Empire's later centuries to pull approaching ships down into the planet's gravity well so that the Rakata could harvest their crews, did not stop functioning when the priests fell. It continued to operate, drawing ships out of the sky for tens of thousands of years afterward, building a ring of wrecks that would outlast every story told about it, with later-era freighters coming down beside the dark Rakatan hulls of the original conquest fleets, all of them piling into the islands of Lahan and adding to a graveyard that no power was willing to clear. What remained of the Rakata, once the priesthood was gone and the warlords had finished tearing at each other, were the elders, the descendants of the surviving priest caste, who lived on the islands of Lehon for thousands of years afterward in a kind of long apology, guarding the Temple of the Ancients, preserving what fragmentary records still existed of the Empire's true scale, and meeting the occasional smuggler or explorer who washed up on their shore with the calm of a people who had nothing left to lose and very little they were still willing to claim. Beyond them, in the space around the system itself, a vast and largely empty region stretched out in nearly every direction, a part of the deep chaos that the old maps described as a largely void area of space with very few stars, almost no traffic, and the silence that fell over a place where something enormous had once been and was no longer. With the first empire of the chaos finally ended, and what it had built in some places still drifting in the void it had left behind. Chapter 2: Csilla and the Old Sith. Several thousand years passed between the last drifting wreck of the Rakatan fleets and the moment when the species that would dominate the modern unknown regions first appeared in any record outside their own world. The Chiss, blue-skinned, red-eyed, born to a frozen homeworld they called Csilla and organized into a system of 9 ruling families and 40 great houses that would remain largely intact for the next 5,000 years, had existed on their planet for longer than the rest of the galaxy would ever fully establish. But the earliest record that the Ascendancy itself acknowledged of its own continuous history dated to roughly 5,100 years before the Empire. And even that early record described a civilization that had already settled into the political shape it would carry into the modern era. For most of those early centuries, the Chiss did not look outward, having Csilla itself, the resources of their system, the careful internal politics of the ruling families and the great houses, and a culture that treated the rest of the galaxy as something to be observed from a distance rather than engaged with directly. That changed slowly around 5,019 years before the Empire, when Chiss exploratory vessels began moving outward from Csilla in greater numbers and reaching deeper into the chaos than any Chiss expedition had ever gone before. And what they found in those years, scattered across worlds that had been empty for tens of thousands of years before anyone living had arrived, was the first thing that would shape the next era of their history. What they recovered in pieces in those early outward voyages was a weapon they would come to call Starflash, a device whose builders the records did not name, whose age they could not date, and whose original purpose they could not infer, but which the Chiss had enough of to begin reconstructing what it did. And what it did was something for which the Chiss had no equivalent in their own engineering, and for which they had no equivalent in any technology their explorers had observed elsewhere in the galaxy. Starflash was a weapon that took a tachyonic burst, fired it into the heart of a sun, and caused the sun to return that burst, amplified by a factor of thousands, back along the original beam path. The Chiss, who recovered the first working examples of it, understood fairly quickly that they had found a weapon that did not belong to them, and they kept the find very quiet. Several centuries later, around 4,300 years before the Empire, the warning the Starflash had been built for, whatever it had been, found Csilla itself, an enemy fleet whose name the Ascendancy records have never agreed on, and which has been variously described in later histories as a coalition of several powers and as a single coordinated force from outside known chaos space, arrived in the Csilla system with the apparent intention of ending the Ascendancy entirely. The Chiss defensive lines held only briefly against a fleet that outnumbered and outmatched everything the Chiss could put into orbit, and the ruling families, meeting in the House Palace of Sapler in what the Ascendancy records remember as the final assault, voted on the use of the weapon they had spent centuries reluctant to use. What followed was carried out by 20 volunteers from the Myth family, who climbed aboard a single Chiss vessel and flew it directly into the center of the enemy formation, into a position from which Starflash could be fired into Chilla's own sun. The records of the Ascendancy describe the firing in measured terms. The tachyonic burst left the Myth ship and entered Chilla's sun, and the sun returned the burst at the calculated factor of thousands. And the burst that came back was wide enough and strong enough that the enemy fleet, the Myth ship at its center, and every Chiss volunteer aboard were vaporized in the same moment, ending the final assault within seconds, and leaving the Ascendancy intact and the 20 Myth, by every account in the Chiss records, lost in the brightness of their own act. What the Chiss had not entirely anticipated when they made the decision to use the weapon was what the firing would do to the sun itself. The tachyonic burst, in passing through the stellar core, had disrupted the fusion processes at the center of Chilla's star, and the disruption would not reverse. Over the decades that followed the final assault, the sun that would not warm again began, slowly and visibly, to cool, with its output dropping year by year, and the average temperatures on Chilla's surface dropping with it, until the homeworld of the Chiss, once a temperate planet that could support open surface cities and broad cultivated continents, began to ice over from the poles inward and from the high latitudes down. By around 4,260 years before the Empire, much of the Chiss civilian population had migrated off Csilla entirely, settling on Avidich, on Rentor, on Sarvchi, and on a network of other Chiss-held worlds that would together carry the population the homeworld could no longer support. Though Csilla itself did not empty, with the ruling families remaining in their estates and the House Palace in Shapler remaining at the political center of the Ascendancy where it had always been, even as the surface around it became a city of ice. But the Chiss who remained on Csilla were a small population by the standards of a capital, and the planet's role from that point onward was as a symbol of continuity rather than as the populous heart it had once been. The truth of what had happened to the sun was buried within a generation. The Stygian family, which had overseen the Starflash project from the beginning, was given custody of the secret and kept it for centuries, transmitting the knowledge only within their own family lines, and the secret that became a family would remain in Stygian hands for nearly the entire span of Chiss history afterward. The Myth family was elevated to a ruling family in recognition of the sacrifice their 20 volunteers had made, and the elevation combined with the secrecy of the Stygian meant that the larger story, the one that involved the cooling of the sun and the cost of the survival, was known to almost no one outside the inner Stygian circle for nearly 4,000 years. The Chiss tried lesser space once in the centuries that followed, sending forces into the Sith Wars era of the deep past, and they did not enjoy what they found there, withdrawing in shame. And centuries later, they formally codified the doctrine that would define them for the rest of their history, the non-aggression law, which forbade the Chiss Defense Force from striking first against any opponent, no matter how clearly that opponent intended harm. The Chiss did not look outward again with any seriousness for a very long time. In the centuries before the Empire, the Stygian quietly discovered a second Starflash device hidden on the world of Sposia, and quietly kept that one as well. By the time the Galactic Empire was rising in the rest of the galaxy, Csilla had become what it would remain through every subsequent era, a capital that was only nominally a capital, with a total population of roughly 60 to 70 million Chiss, the vast majority of them living in illuminated and heated cavern complexes beneath the ice rather than on the surface above, and an official external census figure of 8 billion maintained as a facade to discourage outside interest, and with rotating residents brought up to the surface in shifts to keep the visible avenues of Saplar from looking to any visiting party like the empty ice fields they had become. long before the Galactic Empire was even a possibility, and several thousand years before the Chiss had begun to develop the doctrine that would isolate them from the rest of the galaxy. Another civilization on the other side of the deep galactic map had reached a very similar conclusion about the value of being left alone, and had built, around their own territory, a barrier of a kind that served the same purpose the chaos served for everyone hiding inside it. The ancient Sith Empire, in those distant centuries, sat behind the Stygian Caldera, a vast and slow-moving nebular formation that wrapped around the territories they had claimed, glowing in the deep violet and purple of stellar dust and gas. And the older tellings about the caldera consistently described it as the wall that kept its own people inside as much as it kept everyone else out, with hyperlane charts of the period indicating that entering the Sith Empire was, by some accounts, easier than leaving it. Republic scouts who reached the outer edges of the caldera in later centuries described the formation as something that seemed almost intentional in its arrangement, with the gas and dust shaped into corridors that drew ships inward along certain paths and pushed them away along others, in a manner that did not appear to be the work of any natural stellar process the Republic's astronomers could identify. That Sith Empire eventually fell in the way such empires tended to, and in the long centuries afterward, the traditions of the darker path that had once organized it scattered across the galaxy in smaller and stranger forms. One of those forms, in the years around 3952 before the Empire, gathered at a place called Malachor 5, deep in the lower reaches of charted space, at a place called Traus Academy that had been built into the planet's surface many thousands of years earlier by ancient Sith lords whose names the records no longer carried, and that had been waiting, dormant, for a very long time before what came to be called the Triumvirate arrived. The Triumvirate itself was composed of Darth Traya, who had once been a master of the fallen Lord Revan, alongside Darth Sion and Darth Nihilus, two figures Traya had drawn into the dark side in the years after Revan's fall, and the three of them together did not function as a traditional order at all, but functioned instead, by every account from the period, as a hunger. At the center of that hunger was Darth Nihilus, a hunger given a face. He had been, before his transformation, a survivor of a battle so destructive that it had stripped the surrounding region of life and left only a small number of beings standing in the silence that followed. And Nihilus, in surviving, had been changed into something that no longer functioned as a living being in any conventional sense. A presence that needed to consume life through the Force in order to maintain its own existence. A wound in the Force that wore a ghost-white mask and dark ceremonial robes, and that did not appear in the records the Jedi later recovered from Traus Academy to be capable of stopping itself once the hunger had begun. In the same year, around 3952 before the Empire, Nihilus turned his hunger on the planet Qatar, the homeworld of the Miraluka, where a gathering of Jedi survivors had assembled in the hope of finding what remained of their order. Nihilus arrived in his flagship in orbit above the planet. He extended himself through the Force in the way the Triumvirate's records described, and he drained every living thing on the surface of Qatar in a single act of consumption. The Jedi, the Miraluka, and the smaller fauna and flora of the planet were all gone within hours. The orbital records picked up no struggle, no combat, no detonation. And the act, as it appeared in every later reconstruction, was both silent and complete, with Qatar afterward left as a dead world. A Jedi named Mitra Surik, sometimes called the Jedi Exile in the records that survived, brought down the Triumvirate the following year, by means that the surviving Jedi historians described in carefully measured language, and that involved confronting Nihilus first aboard his own flagship, the Ravager, and then traveling to Malachor 5 to confront Sion and Traya at the Traus Academy itself. With the Academy left empty and Malachor 5 abandoned in the same span of weeks, And the hunger that had run through Traeus did not entirely end with Nihilus's fall, but the institutional form of it was over, and the immediate threat passed into history. What did not pass, in the older tellings, was the mask. Nihilus's ceremonial helmet survived him, and across the millennia that followed, the artifact was reported in different parts of the galaxy, surfacing and disappearing again as it changed hands, with the most persistent of the late reports placing it in a cave on the unknown region's world of Volek during the Imperial era, where pirates and treasure hunters and the small private order known as the Apex Society contested over it without any of them ever quite figuring out how to use what they had found. It was, in those accounts, the mask the galaxy did not know how to destroy. Chapter 3. The Republic Reaches West. There is a great deal that does not fit on a timeline. Across all the centuries between the Triumvirate's fall and the moment the Galactic Republic would first attempt to reach into the deep chaos in numbers, the Western fog continued to hold things that did not move with the rest of galactic history. Things that had been there before the Republic existed and that would still be there long after. And in older tellings, in records the Empire later buried, the deep chaos held more than the maps could carry. Most of what was there had been there for so long that the question of when it had arrived was no longer answerable. And the few species who studied the region from the safer fringes had long ago stopped trying to date their own catalogs against the rest of the galactic record. Mungal, the gray ooze on Mug Fallow, was the entry in those catalogs that the Chiss researchers kept under their most carefully restricted protocols. What the ooze was, in the strictest biological sense, the Ascendancy's xenologists were never able to fully determine. But what it did, when it came into contact with a living body, was clear enough from the standing field observations. The ooze entered through any opening it could find, through the mouth, through the nostrils, through the soft tissue of the eyes, and through the pores of skin if no faster route presented itself. Once inside the body, it digested the brain first, slowly, over the better part of a standard day, replacing the nervous activity of the original mind with its own coordination so that the body kept moving, kept walking, sometimes kept speaking in a hollow imitation of the voice it had once used. After the brain, the ooze worked its way through the rest of the body's organs, hollowing out what remained until the husk that walked the surface of Mug Fallow no longer contained anything of the person who had once arrived there. The animate husks did not last long, with the bodies the ooze had taken beginning to break down after roughly a standard week, and the gray mass that had been inside them flowing back into the larger ocean to wait for the next ship. The ring of derelict vessels around Mug Fallow had been built one ship at a time by exactly this process, with each new wreck added to the ring by a crew whose final act of conscious choice had been, in most cases, deciding to investigate a strange signal coming from a planet that should have been empty. The ocean that thinks had been collecting ships in this manner for so long that the inner edge of the ring contained vessels whose origin shipyards no longer existed anywhere in the galaxy. And the Chiss bounty office in Saplar maintained, almost as a private joke among its researchers, a list of starship classes that had not been seen anywhere else in living memory, but that were still represented, intact and turning slowly in the orbit of a dying world the Chiss themselves were not willing to approach. The Vagari occupied a different role in the deep chaos, one that moved rather than waited. They were a nomadic conqueror species, traveling in fleets of large carrier vessels with crews drawn from the worlds they had broken, and their warships had been modified in a manner that distinguished them from almost every other military design in the galaxy. Around the hulls of the Vagari capital ships, the engineers had built transparent zero-gravity bubbles of reinforced transparent steel, and inside those bubbles, they kept the populations of the worlds they had recently conquered fitted into the hull as a living shield against incoming fire. The bodies fitted to the hull were not silent. Their voices, broadcast on open frequencies for any approaching enemy to hear, served the same intimidation function for the Vagyari that the Starforge had once served for the Rakata. And in records, the Republic would not believe until 27 years before the Empire. The Vagyari were known to the deep chaos as the fleet that arrived with its conquered population still aboard. Further out, in a region the navigation charts called the Cathal Rift, lived a species of a very different kind. The Aying-Ti, with their two spindly arms and long prehensile tails, had built their own civilization inside the rift. Across a span of years, no one outside the rift had ever fully measured. Their ships, semi-organic in nearly every component, moved through the chromatic veil of the rift's gases in patterns that suggested the Aying-Ti saw the Force differently from every other Force-using tradition in the galaxy. And to the Aying-Ti, the Force was not single, but many-stranded, with each strand carrying a different aspect that they perceived as a different color. And they spoke of the rainbow, where others saw only the Force, as if the Jedi and Sith conception of light side and dark side had simply been the simplification of a much wider phenomenon. And the Aying-Ti had no interest in evangelizing this view, simply holding it among themselves, keeping the rift to themselves, and practicing what they called fold space, a technique that allowed them to move physical objects across enormous distances by a single act of force-driven attention. Deeper still lived other species, predatory and isolated and known mostly from the second-hand tales of smugglers who had seen one of their ships from a distance and not been caught by it, appearing in the Chiss catalogs only at the level of names and warnings, with the bounty office classifying them in the same way it classified weather phenomena and recommending the same response. The Croak and the species the Croak called the Lugubra fought their own quiet wars in a corner of the chaos that no one outside their own region had any interest in mapping. And both species had also fought, in cycles that did not quite fit any other history, the spread of Mangal whenever a piece of the ooze had drifted close to their borders. Across all of these regions, the people who lived there had developed a common practical solution to the problem of communicating with each other without being absorbed into the dominant galactic culture. They spoke, when they spoke to outsiders at all, in trade languages built specifically for the purpose, with Sybisti, Menisiat, and Tarja the most widely used among the powers and peoples of the deep chaos. None of these languages were spoken by any species native to the rest of the galaxy. They were languages spoken by people the Republic would never reach, and they had been working perfectly well for that population for longer than the Republic had existed. 29 years before the Galactic Empire, in the years when the late Republic had developed its first serious appetite for finding out what lay beyond its own Western map, the Galactic Senate approved an exploratory expedition unlike anything the Republic had ever attempted. An outbound voyage designed to reach into the chaos, to map a corridor through the western anomalies, and to establish, somewhere on the far side of the wall the Celestials had built, the first permanent Republic presence inside a region that had remained closed to outside contact for most of recorded galactic history. The project was called Outbound Flight, and it was the work of a Jedi Master named Joris Sibaoth, who had spent years convincing the Senate that the Order needed a frontier and the Republic needed a future on the western side of the map. The design of the vessel was unprecedented, with at its center a long storage core meant to carry the colonists, the equipment, the agricultural reserves, and the long-range communications array. Wrapped around that core, in a six-pointed arrangement, were 6 Dreadnought-class heavy cruisers, each one a fully crewed warship in its own right, linked at the hubs to the central core in a configuration that allowed the entire structure to move through hyperspace as a single object. By the time the expedition was ready to launch, the storage core held what the Republic's records described as 6 Jedi Masters, 12 Jedi Knights, and 50,000 men, women, and children. drawn from a cross-section of Republic citizens who had been told, with no particular exaggeration, that they were going somewhere no one had ever come back from. Outbound Flight launched from Yaga Minor 27 years before the Empire, against the Senate's lingering reservations and with the active opposition of more than one Jedi Master who believed the project was a mistake. The Masters who had opposed the project had been right to oppose it, and Darth Sidious, watching the project from his Senate chair under his other name, understood almost immediately that an organized Jedi expedition into the chaos was the last thing his long-term plans could permit, and he dispatched 2 assets to deal with it. The first was Kinman Doriana, his most trusted political operative, sent into the chaos with a fleet of Trade Federation vulture droids and a single difficult mission. The second was Doriana's instructions on whom to approach for help. Somewhere in the Western chaos, Sidious had been told by sources he never fully trusted but had no better alternative to consult. There was a Chiss commander operating under the name Mithrov Nuruodo, and that commander was, by every account, the only entity in the region with both the tactical capability and the political flexibility to intercept Outbound Flight before it could establish a permanent foothold. Doriana found Mithrov Nuruodo at an outpost called Krustai, presented his case in the careful diplomatic register that the situation required, and explained the threat the expedition posed not only to the Republic's enemies, but to the Chiss themselves, given how close Outbound Flight's projected course would pass to Chiss space. The Chiss commander, having agreed to assist, positioned his flagship, the Springhawk, alongside a sister cruiser called the Whirlwind, which had been fitted with a captured Vagari gravity well projector, and used the Whirlwind's projector to pull Outbound Flight out of hyperspace at the exact moment the expedition passed through the engagement zone. Thrawn had selected along the course it was already on. What waited for the Jedi in normal space when the expedition emerged was the Vagari fleet itself, the slaver fleets whose voices had broadcast for a generation, now arrayed in the position the Chiss commander had selected for them. The Jedi fought well with the 6 Masters aboard, joined to each other through a force battle meld that allowed them to coordinate at speeds no individual Jedi could match, breaking the initial Vagari attack and holding the central core long enough for the dreadnought cruisers to mount a counter-offensive in which the Vagari took heavy losses and the Jedi line held. And then, in the moment the meld was at its strongest, the vulture droids that Doriana had quietly attached to the back of the engagement zone activated their secondary payload. The radiation bombs aboard the droids detonated in sequence, 6 of them in 6 different dreadnoughts, within seconds of each other. And every Jedi aboard the expedition, with the exception of one, fell within the same span of time. The one was Jorus C'baoth himself, in whom the radiation that took the rest of the Order also took most of his remaining restraint. And in the final minutes of the engagement, with his fellow Masters fallen around him and the meld collapsed, C'baoth reached out across the system through the Force, found the Chiss commander on the bridge of the Springhawk, and tried to choke him to death from across the gulf. But the attempt did not succeed, and C'baoth himself fell when the vulture droids breached the hull of the central core and the structural integrity of the storage section collapsed. 2 members of the expedition's secondary command, Thrawn's own brother Thras, and the Jedi Lorana Jinsler, brought the remains of the structure down in a controlled crash into an uninhabited star cluster the Ascendancy called the Redoubt, and 57 survivors who waited half a century to be found climbed out of the wreckage onto the cold surface of a world that had no name on the Republic charts. They built a small colony inside what was left of the central core, living on the agricultural reserves, the recycled water systems, and the salvaged generators, with no way to send a distress signal that anyone outside the chaos would ever hear. And they remained where they had crashed for the next 50 years, raising children inside the broken dreadnought hubs and burying their own dead in shallow graves on the surface. Until 22 years after the Empire's fall, A Chiss patrol vessel called the Chaff Envoy came across the wreck during a routine survey and found the descendants of the original expedition still living there. The Corellian smuggler whom the Chiss commander had taken aboard at Krustai before the Outbound Flight engagement, a man named Yorj Cardas, did not stay in the Chiss orbit for long. After his health failed in the years following the engagement, the Jedi Master Yoda arranged for Cardas to be brought to the Aing Ti of the Cathol Rift, where the monks who saw the Force as a rainbow taught him a smaller version of their gift. And Cardas spent the remainder of his life moving in and out of the deep chaos in ways that no Republic intelligence service was ever able to track. While the Outbound Flight wreck cooled on its forgotten world, something else was already moving in the deep chaos that no one in the Republic yet understood. Beyond the western anomalies, beyond even the edges of the Chiss survey range, a species of extragalactic origin had been watching the galaxy for years from the far side of the void, and their advanced scouts, traveling in vessels that the few Republic patrols who saw them at all mistook for asteroids until they began to move under power, had already begun the work of mapping the routes the main invasion would later use. The species would, in records since lost to most modern archives, eventually be called the Yuuzhan Vong. And the conflict they brought into the galaxy, beginning roughly 25 years after the Empire's fall, would be the war that would cost the galaxy more lives than any other single conflict in its recorded history. One of their advance forces, around 32 years before the Galactic Empire, had already entered the chaos and discovered something that surprised them. In a region called the Gardaji Rift sat a living planet, a sentient world called Zonama Sekot, which had drifted into the rift from elsewhere in the galaxy a century or more before. The advance force, accustomed to dealing with the dead matter of conventional worlds, did not know what to do with a planet that could speak. A Jedi named Vergere, who happened to be present on Zonama Sekot during the encounter, negotiated their withdrawal by leaving with them, walking aboard their lead vessel and disappearing into the wider scout network without ever sending word back to the Republic that had sent her. The Republic had reached, and the chaos had answered. The answer had cost the Order 6 masters, 12 knights, and nearly 50,000 civilians at the redoubt alone, and had cost the Republic the services of a Jedi who never came home from Zonama Sekot, and had cost the Republic, in the years that followed, much of its appetite for further expeditions into the Western Fog. With the map's western edge, after Outbound Flight, left where it had always been and where the Republic now found itself content to leave it. Chapter 4. Smiles Before the War. In the years before the Empire formally announced itself in the rest of the galaxy, the chaos still held the political order it had carried for centuries. The Leoin regime governed its own corner of the Western Fog. The Tower Dimension, governed by the Urchiv Key species who called the sector home, occupied another. The Patatus Hiveborn occupied a string of systems closer to Chiss space. The Vac Combine held the worlds around Primea, and the Pakosh of Rapak held a smaller cluster of refugee-friendly systems on the deeper edge of the Western Fog, with none of these powers carrying any particular interest in expansion, and none of them having been at serious conflict with each other for longer than most of their citizens had been alive. The chaos, in the years immediately before 19 years before the Empire, was, by its own standards, quiet. That quiet ended with the arrival of the Nicardun destiny. The Nicardun were a militarist power from outside the established Chaos Order, led by a general who called himself Yiv the Benevolent, and Yiv's method of conquest, refined over years of practice against smaller powers in the regions further out, was a careful campaign of smiles and treaties that arrived at each new world with diplomatic gifts before the warships did. By the time the Nicardun fleets crossed into the central chaos, Yiv had already absorbed several sectors that would have, under other circumstances, been considered firm holdings of the older powers, and the encirclement of Chiss space, which the Ascendancy did not initially recognize as an encirclement, was well advanced. Smiles and treaties at the edge of the map had been Yve's signature for so long that the Chiss intelligence services, when they finally began to assemble the pattern, found that they had been looking at it for longer than they had realized. The Nicardun struck at Csilla itself in 19 years before the Empire. 3 antiquated Patatus warships, coerced by Nicardun pressure into a mission their captains did not particularly want, entered the Csilla system and opened fire on the orbital defenses, doing very little damage and being quickly brought down. The attack was the first direct assault on the Chiss capital in decades, and the Ascendancy treated it with the seriousness the symbolism deserved. What the Chiss did not initially understand was that the Csilla attack had been a feint. While the Ascendancy's attention was focused on the orbital defense, a Nicardun strike force ambushed a Magician refugee ship in the Dioya system, ending the lives of or capturing most of those aboard, and leaving the remaining survivors to flee in a smaller vessel toward whichever sanctuary they could reach. The Chiss commander assigned to the response was Mithro Nuruodo, then a senior officer of the Chiss Expansionary Defense Fleet, and the response Thrawn organized over the following weeks was both methodical and unexpected. He worked with the Vok Combine, whose homeworld of Primea had been one of the sectors the Nicardun were preparing to absorb, combining Chiss tactics with Combine numbers. And at the Battle of Primea, in the same year as the Csilla fight, Thrawn captured Yve the Benevolent personally, ending the Nicardun campaign as a coordinated operation and leaving the broader destiny scattered across the sectors it had been about to consume. The Magician refugee ship that the Nicardun had ambushed in Dioya had been carrying the survivors of a civil conflict on the planet codenamed Sunrise, the homeworld of an unnamed multi-armed species whose prophetic matriarch, called the Magis by her own people, had been forced into flight by the fighting that had broken out across her world. The Magis herself had survived the Dioya ambush by chance, and she reached the safety of a different system with what remained of her people in time to begin trying to understand why her world had collapsed so completely and so quickly into a conflict it had never appeared headed for. The investigation she began would, within months, lead her into the broader pattern. The pattern had been initiated by an Agbui telepath named Huplif. The Agbui were a small and physically delicate people who read emotions through direct skin contact, and they had been operating for years as client agents of a power that the Chaos had not yet identified. Huplif had spent months on Sunrise, moving between the factions in the early days of the dispute, touching shoulders in tea ceremonies, and reading the emotional state of every leader he met, and gradually nudging each leader by tactical word and selective revelation toward the conclusions that would push them into open hostility. The conflict on Sunrise had been a war within the prophecy, engineered from outside by someone Sunrise had treated as a guest. The Magis fled with the surviving 200 members of her flight onto the Rapak system, the homeworld of the Pakosh, where the Pakosh, true to their long reputation as the refugee-friendly power of the deeper chaos, took the magicians in without conditions. The Magis was offered shelter, medical attention for her wounded, and time to grieve, though she refused most of what was offered, having decided in the time between Sunrise and Rapax that the cause of the civil conflict was beyond any solution available in the world of the living, and that her people, all 200 of them, would have to take their grief out of the world entirely if Sunrise itself was to heal. The Magis ordered her people to accept ritual death together, all 200 of them, so that their souls could pass beyond the world and intercede on behalf of Sunrise from a place where, by her people's belief, the intercession would be heard. The Pakosh did not know how to refuse her. Thrawn, by this point in his career, operating with considerable independence in the chaos, arrived at Rapak with a different solution. He placed the Magis herself in a hibernation chamber, suspending her so that the ritual could not proceed without her, and he offered her people the alternative of joining the broader Chiss campaign against the power that had engineered their war. on the understanding that the journey she believed her people had to take would be paused, not denied, until the larger conflict was settled. The larger conflict by that point had begun to assume a shape that the Ascendancy was finally able to read. The agent behind Haplif, the same agent who had trained Yiv the Benevolent for conquest and who had been moving Nikardun pieces across the Chaos board for years, was a member of a species the Chiss had heard rumors about but had never confirmed, a figure who went by the name Jixtus and was, by his own admission, a Gresk. And the Grisks, in records, the Chiss had been keeping under their tightest restrictions for the better part of a decade, were a species that did not invade with fleets in the conventional sense. They invaded by bending the minds of the species that lived around them, subjugating worlds with very few personnel, and kidnapping force-sensitive children to navigate their own ships. The final move of the campaign came at Sposia, the world where the Stybla family had hidden their second Starflash device some centuries earlier. Jixtus had assembled a combined fleet drawn from the Kilji Illumine, a theocratic power he had aligned with after Yiv's fall, and he meant to use that fleet to break the Chiss Ascendancy in a single coordinated strike. The Stybla brought out the second Starflash and fired it into Sposia's sun. The burst returned as it had 4,000 years earlier, and the combined Kilji Grisk fleet, with Jixtus himself aboard one of the lead vessels, was vaporized in the same way the first enemy fleet at Csilla had been vaporized so long before. Chilla's sun, in the years immediately following, completed its long cooling. By the time the Galactic Empire had risen to dominance in the rest of the galaxy, the cooling had completed, and Csilla itself, capital of an ascendancy that the rest of the galaxy still did not know how to find on a map, sat at the center of the western fog as a world of ice. Chapter 5. The Empire Goes West. In the older telling, in the years immediately following the Outbound Flight engagement, the Chiss commander who had pulled the expedition out of hyperspace along its course found himself in a position the Ascendancy had not prepared for, having violated the non-aggression law by striking first against a Republic expedition that had not yet attacked the Chiss, in cooperation with a Sith Lord's personal operative and at the expense of nearly 50,000 civilian lives, and the Syndicure debated the case for months before delivering a verdict as severe as Chiss politics allowed. Thrawn was stripped of his commission, separated from his family ties, and exiled to a small, unnamed world in the deeper chaos, with no supplies, no support, and no expectation that he would still be alive when anyone next looked for him. Some months after the exile, when no one in the Syndicure had any particular reason to think Thrawn might still be alive, an Imperial scout patrol passing through the deeper western reaches of the chaos, under the command of an officer named Voss Park, made an unscheduled detour to investigate a faint signal that appeared on the long-range sensors of his cruiser. The signal was neither military nor Republic in origin, and what the patrol found at its source when they arrived was a single blue-skinned figure sitting on a small rocky world that had no name on any chart. Surrounded by the remains of a wrecked freighter he had apparently dismantled for parts. Watching the Imperial cruiser arrive with the calm of someone who had not been particularly surprised by the visit. The captain, who found the most dangerous mind in the chaos waiting on a rock, brought the figure aboard. Listened to him explain, in measured basic, who he was and what he understood about the strategic position of the Empire in the Western Galaxy, and forwarded the encounter directly to Palpatine. Palpatine recognized the value of what Park had brought him within hours of the report's arrival. By the time the Imperial recruitment officers reached Thrawn formally, the broad outlines of an arrangement had already been worked out, with Thrawn agreeing to serve the Empire openly in exchange for the support of Imperial resources in his own private campaign in the deeper chaos, and with Palpatine agreeing to give him substantial latitude in exchange for access to a corner of the galaxy no Imperial intelligence service had been able to penetrate on its own. The exile rock that became a beginning receded into Thrawn's personal history. He was given a Star Destroyer, the Admonitor, captained by a man named Dagan Neriz, with Voss Park serving as his executive officer, and he began to operate in those early years of the Empire as the public face of a much larger and much quieter project. That project, in the older telling in records the New Republic later marked as legend, was the Empire of the Hand. Thrawn had built it slowly and without the awareness of the broader Imperial command structure, from a fortress called the Hand of Thrawn on the world of Narawan. A 5-towered installation hidden inside the deeper chaos and operated by a small command staff drawn from both Imperial defectors loyal to him personally and Chiss officers who had quietly maintained their original allegiance. By 19 years after the Galactic Empire's fall at Endor, the Shadow Empire no map would show had grown to control the equivalent of some 250 sectors, by some accounts, in the regions of the chaos that the official Galactic Empire had never reached. One of the powers Thrawn had been fighting through the Empire of the Hand was the warlord Nuso Esva, sometimes called the Stormhare by those who had served under him, a figure who had built his own holdings in the deeper chaos by conquering several of the smaller systems the Nicardun had once been planning to absorb. Esva and Thrawn fought a long, quiet war over the course of more than a decade. Thrawn defeated Esva's eastern fleet in the Poln system using a death squadron led by the Imperial flagship Executor, and several years later, in 8 years after the Galactic Empire's fall, Thrawn finally brought down Esva himself on the world of Quethold by hijacking the loudspeaker channel that carried the Quesoth Queen of the Red's orders to her soldiers, manipulating Esva into believing she had turned against him, and watching as Esva struck her down only to be struck down in turn by her Quesoth soldiers. With the Stormhare falling on Quethold and the Long Shadow campaign ending in the same coordinated moment. While all of that was unfolding in the older telling, in the rest of the galaxy, a different and quieter campaign had been running for far longer. Palpatine had known about the unknown regions in considerable detail long before the Empire was officially declared. And in the years before he ever sat the throne, he had begun work on a project he intended to use as an insurance policy against the eventual failure of all he was building. The project had begun, in some accounts, as early as 30 years before the formal rise of the Empire, and its physical headquarters had been built on a desolate outer rim world called Jakku, where the construction crews had been working under heavy Imperial secrecy since long before the Clone Wars had even begun. The headquarters, called the Jakku Observatory, sat beneath the Plaintive Hand Plateau, a geologically ancient formation that the early Imperial surveys had selected for the structural stability of its bedrock. And the observatory itself was not, in the conventional sense, an observatory at all. It was a deep listening installation with a single very specific mission, and the centerpiece of the construction was the borehole that went to the planet's core, drilled by Imperial engineering teams over a span of years and fitted with the kind of sensor and processing equipment that could only have been built by a state with effectively unlimited resources. The borehole's purpose was to anchor a long baseline observation array, and the array's purpose was to listen patiently and continuously to the unknown regions. What the observatory was listening for in the careful records the Empire later filed away under code names that would not be understood for decades were the signals returning from the Imperial probe droids that had been seeded across the chaos in numbers no other intelligence service had ever attempted. Most of the droids did not return signals at all, and of those that did, some transmitted data that the observatory's processors could integrate into the developing map of the region, while others in the description that the Imperial archives later preserved verbatim came back filled with enough inane babble to serve as a perfectly clear sign that the explorer had gone utterly mad out there in isolation. The chaos that the observatory's computers were slowly assembling year by year and probe by probe was, in the same archived language, an unexplored infinity, one closed off by a labyrinth of solar storms, rogue magnetospheres, black holes, gravity wells, and things far stranger. The observatory had been discovered around 30 years before the Empire by a small orphan boy living in the dust of Jakku who had managed to climb into the construction site without being noticed by the security perimeter and who had spent some hours inside the structure before he was caught. Palpatine, when he was informed of the incident, did not order the boy's removal, but rather his recruitment. And the orphan, whose name was Galli, was brought into Palpatine's personal service and renamed Gallius Rax. And over the following decades, Rax would grow into the role Palpatine had selected for him, that of the counselor to the Empire and the chief executor of a plan that no other Imperial officer was ever entrusted with. That plan was called the Contingency, and it activated in the year 5 after the Empire's formal fall, when the New Republic's forces closed on Jakku for what would prove to be the last major engagement of the Galactic Civil War. While the Imperial line collapsed on the surface of Jakku and the Loyalist fleets above it died in numbers no Republic historian later disputed, the elect of the Contingency, Grand Admiral Ray Sloane, the Imperial officer, Brendel Hux, his young son Armitage, and several thousand others lifted off Jakku in the vessels Rax had quietly held in reserve and accelerated west into the chaos along the route the observatory had spent 30 years computing. The Empire that flew west while its body died on Jakku joined the other Imperial elements Palpatine had already placed in the deep chaos, including the star dreadnought Eclipse, pre-positioned years earlier as the seed of the resurgence to come. For the next 10 years, the Empire that had flown west operated as something between an exile community and a hidden infrastructure project. The fleets that had carried the Contingency west settled into the systems the observatory had marked, anchored themselves in orbits that no New Republic patrol would ever cross, and began the slow work of converting their position from a refuge into a base of operations. Old hyperlanes that had been used for generations by the species native to the deeper chaos were quietly surveyed and updated. New beacons were placed along corridors no Imperial vessel had previously navigated, and construction yards were built in systems whose existence the New Republic had never confirmed. With the result that from roughly 5 years after the Empire's official fall to roughly 15, the Imperial remnant operating in the Western Fog did, by every later account, what no previous power in the galaxy had done in the same span of time, taming the unknown regions. At the center of the new infrastructure, in the years that followed the taming, the Imperial engineers built a vessel that did not have a fixed home port. The Supremacy, a mega-class star dreadnought larger than any warship the Empire had previously fielded, was designed to move continuously through the Western chaos with its own production lines aboard. With TIE fighter factories running in its lower decks and command facilities operating on its upper structure, and with the entire vessel functioning in effect as a moving capital, it was a shipyard that was also a flagship. The Resistance, when it later discovered the Supremacy's capabilities, did not initially believe the intelligence reports on its size. And the disbelief, as the records later showed, was a reasonable response to what the Empire had built. While the Supremacy moved through the Western Fog, the Imperial remnant turned its attention to another world the Republic had once protected. Ilum, the ice planet of the Jedi pilgrimage, sat in a corner of the unknown regions that the Republic had marked on its old charts as Sector 7G, and the planet had, for generations before the rise of the Empire, served as the source of the kyber crystals that fed every Jedi lightsaber the Order had built. The Imperial engineers turned that world into a weapon. They cut a trench along the planet's equator, hollowed out a deep firing chamber within, and converted the entire 660-kilometer body of Ilum into Starkiller Base, a single mobile superweapon capable of drawing the energy of a nearby star and releasing it across interstellar distances at any target the Empire chose to select. The surgery performed on a sacred world was complete by the time the New Republic noticed it was missing. At the other end of the new Imperial position, on a world the deep chaos called Exegol, and that the older records of the dark side called Ixigul, a different and far older project had been waiting for centuries to be reactivated. Exegol had once been a green world, fertile and temperate, before the ancient Dark Lords who had once claimed it in the deep past drew enough dark energy from its surface to drain the planet of nearly everything that had once lived there. The world that remained was dark, barren, rocky, and lit primarily by the constant lightning storms that crossed its sky. It was a box system, accessible only along a single hyperlane and only with the use of a Sith wayfinder. And the order that had built itself there had been operating in secret for so long that almost no record outside their own archive acknowledged that they existed. That order was the Sith Eternal, and they had been waiting for Palpatine to die. When he did, in the explosion of the second Death Star over Endor, their preparations activated Palpatine's consciousness by means they had spent millennia preparing for, transferred at the moment of physical death into a cloned body the Order had been growing on Exegol. And Palpatine himself returned to physical existence in a form that needed considerable maintenance and that did not last as long as the original had, took his seat on the throne the Order had built him in the depths of the Sith Citadel. And because he needed a face other than his own to operate publicly, the vats below the Citadel had been growing one for him across the same long decades. The face the Order had grown was called Snoke, and Snoke was not, in the conventional sense, a person. He was a strandcast, a manufactured being grown from combined genetic material drawn from sources the Order had been collecting for generations. And Snoke had been designed to function as a Palpatine proxy while the original consciousness operated from the Citadel below. The Order had not grown only one. The vats that held more than one of him held the brothers grown alongside the active proxy, kept alive in the tanks against the possibility that the operating version might need to be replaced, though none of them ever fully developed. None of them were ever activated, and they remained in their tanks for the rest of the era. In 29 years after the formal fall of the Empire, the First Order publicly announced itself in the rest of the galaxy. The announcement, when it came, was not a declaration of war so much as a presentation of a power that had already finished building itself. And the rest of the galaxy, which had not been watching the chaos for any meaningful length of time, was startled by the scale of the force that had emerged from it. Leia Organa, who had been arguing for years inside the New Republic Senate that the Imperial remnant had never truly ended, formed the Resistance in the same year, against considerable internal political opposition and with the support of only a fraction of the New Republic's official military. In 34 years after the Empire's fall, the First Order fired Starkiller Base for the first time. The energy drawn from a nearby star crossed interstellar distances in seconds, struck the Hosnian system where the New Republic's capital sat, and ended the central government of the galaxy in a single coordinated strike. With the capital system lost and the Senate, the Chancellor, the bulk of the New Republic Navy, and an unknowable civilian population in the orbital districts gone before the rest of the galaxy could finish processing the news. The Republic, after the Hosnian cataclysm, was effectively no longer a functioning government, and the resistance Leia Organa had built was the only meaningful military opposition the First Order still faced. 1 year later, in 35 years after the Empire's fall, the final Order rose from Exegol. The Order had spent decades preparing the box system's shipyards for the moment, and what came up out of Exegol's atmosphere when they activated was a fleet of Zyston-class star destroyers, each one fitted with an axial superlaser capable of cracking a planet with their own children, trained from birth for the moment, operating most of the bridge stations. The Resistance, by some accounts assembled from a smaller fleet than any previous galactic conflict had been won with, met the final Order in orbit above Exegol in a battle that was brief by the standards of any other major engagement in in galactic history, ending with the final order broken, the Citadel collapsing. The cloned body Sidious had spent decades inhabiting, falling with the throne it had been built into, and the cult's last patient day ending in the same lightning the order had built itself around. Chapter 6. Beyond the Galaxy. While the rest of the galaxy was watching the slow rise of the First Order and the patient assembly of the Final Order, another effort had been underway in the deep chaos for years, one that no Imperial archive had recorded. It had begun around 9 years after the Empire's fall, and it had been led by Morgan Elsbeth, a surviving Night Sister of Dathomir who had spent the years since the Clone Wars building ships for the Imperial Navy, and ruling as Magistrate of Calodan on Corvus before devoting herself entirely to Thrawn's return, and who now had the time, the discretion, and the resources to attempt something no organized power in the galaxy had previously tried to build. Elsbeth's project was the Eye of Sion, a hyperspace transport ring scaled not to move a single ship, but to carry an entire Imperial Star Destroyer across distances ordinary hyperspace lanes could not reach. The ring was built in slow stages, in a system no New Republic patrol had ever catalogued. And the engineers Elsbeth had drawn to her had worked for years on the construction, without any of them fully understanding what the ring was being built to do. At its center sat 3 clusters, port, starboard, and ventral, fitted with 7 Super Star Destroyer hyperdrive cores in total, drawn from 9 cores secretly diverted out of the Corellian shipyards, with 2 never fully accounted for, all arranged in a configuration no shipyard had attempted before. It was the ring that crossed the void between galaxies. What the ring was being built to cross was not, in the strict sense, unknown to the Jedi. The architect droid Huyang, who had served the Order since the earliest centuries of its existence, had spoken to his apprentices over many lifetimes of the older archives that described what the ring's destination would be, recalling that the Jedi archives spoke of intergalactic hyperspace lanes between galaxies which used to follow the migration paths of star whales named Purrgil. The Purrgil themselves had been moving along those routes for a span of years no record now living could measure, and the route the Eye of Sion was being built to follow was the route the Purrgil had always known. At the other end of that route, far outside the spiral arm of the main galaxy and across a stretch of intergalactic void no Republic vessel had ever crossed, sat Peridea, a world old by every measure available, with its gray and dust-laden surface carrying the ruins of a civilization that had used the Ur-Kitat script in carvings on its standing stones, and its atmosphere holding the silence of a place where almost nothing else lived. Around it, slowly turning in a planetary ring that could be seen from the surface throughout most of the day, lay the bone ring of every Purrgil that had ever died. Peridea, in the older record the Jedi Archive had preserved, had been the dying ground of the species. It had also been the homeworld of the Night Sisters, who had ridden the Purrgil into the main galaxy at some point in the deep past and settled on Dathomir. And 3 of their oldest, called the Great Mothers, still lived on Peridea in a tower they had occupied for longer than any of them was willing to specify. The Great Mothers were named Clothau, Actrapaw, and Lachesis, and they claimed, in the manner of beings who had outlived almost everything they had known, to read the threads of fate themselves. And they claimed, in the same calm voice, to predate the founding of the Jedi Order. Whether any of that was true was a question no record now living could answer. It was the Great Mothers who, by means of the kind of dark magic that the Night Sister tradition had carried with them across the void between galaxies, had been able to communicate with Morgan Elsbeth during the construction of the Eye of Sion. And it was the Great Mothers who had been waiting for the ring to be ready. The figure they had been waiting for was Thrawn. He had been pulled to Peridea by a flock of Purrgil at the end of the liberation of Lothal, 1 year before the Battle of Yavin. and he had spent the 10 years since then on the gray surface of the dying ground, waiting for someone, finally, to come for him. While Peridea was returning Thrawn to the main galaxy, the Killiks of the Deep Chaos, who had slept beneath the Chiss border for nearly 30,000 years since their long retreat into the unknown regions, had begun, in records since lost to most of the modern archive, to stir again. The hive that woke would, in the years that followed, push briefly against the Chiss frontier and then settle back into the long quiet from which it had emerged. And after all of it, after the Eye of Sion had crossed back into the main galaxy with Thrawn aboard, after the final order had risen and fallen at Exegol, and the Sith Eternal had ended in the lightning of its own world, the unknown regions were quiet again. The hyperlanes that had been opened by the Imperial remnant during the long taming closed back over, and the Chiss returned to their old policy of not looking outward. And the species who had always lived in the Western Fog continued to live there, in the languages the Republic would never reach, in the orbits the maps had never charted, with the chaos folding closed behind them, as it always had, and the western edge of the galaxy thinning out once again into the same soft fading edge of light it had carried since the Celestials had first walled it off.